Gun violence in this country is an epidemic. Let me say it again. Gun violence in this country is an epidemic, and it's an international embarrassment.
U.S. President Joe Biden unveils a series of executive actions to combat gun violence while calling on Congress to do more. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. To be clear, when it comes to curbing guns in the United States, the power of the president is limited. The Constitution vests that power with Congress. It's then up to the Supreme Court to determine if the congressional action violates the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms. It's a political debate that's gone on for decades, but with mass shootings on the rise and a growing impatience from gun control activists, President Biden took what steps he could while calling on Congress to do even more. For the latest, we turn to CGTN's White House correspondent Nathan King. And so, Nathan, the president used the bully pulpit on Thursday to try and encourage congressional action, but he also laid out several ways his administration will tackle gun violence, including these ghost guns and so-called red flag laws. Explain all of this to us.
Yeah, I mean, there's a limit to what the president can do, but he is acting. A lot of people thought he'd gone silent after the recent spate of mass shootings in Atlanta, Georgia, where it seemed Asian women were targeted, in Boulder, Colorado, 10 killed in a supermarket. We saw one in South Carolina. I mean, they're just every day. But he is announcing action, and essentially ghost guns are these guns you can buy parts of on the internet and put them together yourself. They don't have serial numbers. That's quite incredible. That was has been used in shootings. And then there's stabilizers, which you can hold for a handgun, which basically makes them much more accurate. Those also are going to be limited. And these red flag laws, essentially what it allows is relatives of people who they think are disturbed or may commit violent acts to sort of raise a red flag to have guns taken away or to stop people buying them. And law enforcement can do that as well. Let's listen to the president, because he also laid out this idea that it's not just an American problem, but it's a problem for the U.S. abroad too, and its reputation.
These are some of the best tools we have right now to prevent gun violence and save lives. But all these bills, they had support of both Democrats and Republicans in the House. And universal background checks are supported by the vast majority of the American people. And I might add, the vast majority of responsible gun owners. The only industry in America, a billion-dollar industry, that can't be sued, has exempt from being sued, are gun manufacturers. If I get one thing on my list, the Lord came down and said, Joe, you get one of these, give me that one. Because I tell you what, there would be a come to the Lord moment these folks would have real quickly.
Yeah, litigation against gun companies would perhaps limit something, but essentially it's going to require more action than that. It's just so many guns here in the US, 120 guns per 100 people. And when you look at gun owners, it's a lot of gun owners with a lot of guns. A lot of the population don't own them, but the people who do tend to have multiple guns as well. 16 times as many mass shootings, which is shootings of 4 or more people, than Germany and other comparable countries. No wonder he says it's an international stain, because no other country, hyper-developed country, has this sort of gun violence.
Nathan, we've also got this USA Today Ipsos poll that was taken last month in the wake of 2 mass shootings. It shows 2/3 of Americans back tougher gun laws. But when you break it down, about 54% support among Republicans 2 years ago has now plummeted to 35%. Democratic support staying about the same, now at 90%. How likely are we going to see anything significant coming from Congress?
I think you said it. You know, the polarization in the country is reflected here on Capitol Hill, and while the president can do some things, it really is up to legislation in Congress. Now, a lot of bills have passed the House, for example, background checks for over 10 days, which stops people buying a gun until they've been cleared, that can be extended for the FBI. There are also other things on the books, for example, an assault weapons ban, which is essentially, you know, semi-automatic guns like the AR-15 as well. And, you know, polling It depends what you ask in any poll. But when it's guns, for example, as the president said, 65% of gun owners actually support enhanced background checks. There are a lot of responsible gun owners in this country who don't like their image as gun owners, mainly in rural areas, who want to protect their property by people who commit these heinous acts. But given the power of the lobby, the National Rifle Association, even though it's having financial problems, has had over the Republican Party and the donor money, and the fact that there are a lot of gun owners in very swing districts which Republicans want to keep in states that are generally vote red, it's unlikely. However, as you know, this president is moving quickly and fast. They could try and get something through, but I was there at Sandy Hook nearly 10 years ago, and all those horrible images of those beautiful children mowed down, and I thought, surely the US is going to do something now, and they did very little because Congress wouldn't act. So I wouldn't bet any money on it. Back to you, Mike.
Thanks, Nathan. That's CGTN's Nathan King reporting. There's a lot to talk about here. Let's get right to our panel. Richard Feldman is a gun rights advocate and former lobbyist for the National Rifle Association. Robert Spitzer is a distinguished service professor of political science with the State University of New York at Cortland. He's written extensively about gun control. Joseph Williams is a senior news editor with U.S. News and World Report. And Manuel Oliver lost his son Joaquin in the 2018 shooting at Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. He has since co-founded Change the Ref, a nonprofit dedicated to reducing the political influence of the National Rifle Association. And Manuel, we're going to start with you. You lost your son, nicknamed Guac, in 2018 at the school shooting. So often these conversations kind of pivot from policies to politics, but it's really about people. It's people who decide to go out for an evening out, go to a movie. In Colorado years ago, they never return home. It's somebody saying, hey, I'm going to run to the grocery store and get a carton of milk. They get gunned down in the grocery aisle. In your case, it's your son going off to school and never coming home. So talk to us about that day. And then also, if you will, talk to us about what it's like to see this repeated over and over again, more mass shootings.
Well, thank you for having me here, and thank you for all the panelists to be here also. That day, that was the worst day ever. Nobody wants to go through that, not as a father, and of course, not as Joaquin. Kids of today, our kids, your kids, because I don't have mine anymore, are afraid to go to school. It could happen. The fact that there hasn't been a mass shooting in a school since the last year is a result of COVID and schools being empty. And that's a pretty shameful thing to say. What has happened since that day is that more than 120,000 people have lost their lives because of gun violence. And I've heard these conversations back and forward. And I finally heard a leader yesterday saying things the way they should be said. So I was expecting some solutions during the other administration. And then now I finally see a door that it opens so we can keep on demanding and asking and move forward to save lives.
Richard, you were a lobbyist for the NRA. You wrote this Ricochet, Confessions of a Gun Lobbyist, about your own experience. It was just 3 weeks ago that we saw the mass shootings in Atlanta. 8 people died there. Since then, there's been 20 more mass shootings. You just heard Nathan talking about this USA Today poll where a majority of Americans want some kind of legislation. Let's listen to what Biden had to say.
Every day in this country, 316 people are shot every single day. 106 of them die every day. Our flag was still flying at half-staff for the victims of the horrific murder of 8 primarily Asian American people in Georgia, when 10 more lives were taken in a mass murder in Colorado. You probably didn't hear it, but between those 2 incidents, less than 1 week apart, there were more than 850 additional shootings. 850 that took the lives of more than 250 people and left 500 injured. This is an epidemic, for God's sake. and it has to stop.
Richard, he says it has to stop. I heard Nathan talking about Wayne LaPierre and the Sandy Hook shooting, and I remember that news conference. I think most reporters thought, well, they'd come out, have some kind of olive branch, say, maybe we can talk about this or that. Why is it the NRA wants to stand in the way of any kind of meaningful legislation on this?
I don't think it's really that complicated. Groups like NRA are often far more motivated by the politics surrounding the issue and the attendant fundraising and membership recruitment than they are regarding resolving difficult and complicated policy considerations, which certainly the whole gun issue is far more complicated. There are different parts to it. Some approaches would have an effect on some parts, but not on others. And when we discuss the whole issue, which is complicated, we lose the opportunity to at least focus on something that would be useful some of the time and move on from there.
So is the issue that it should just be incremental and that everybody wants to go big or go home?
Well, I think it's more complicated than just being incremental, but we got to be targeted. We have to align the policy and the politics. When you look at the polling and understand what it means, there are certain things that are within the reach of the administration and the Congress that can be passed, and there are other things that aren't going to happen, and throwing them all together almost ensures that nothing will happen.
Robert, you studied gun control. Is the problem a legal one? You always hear people talking about the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, but even Justice Antonin Scalia, the late justice, said that these laws, the right to bear arms, it's not absolute. To quote the title of one of your books, how do we reconcile gun rules and gun rights?
Well, the fact is, and the irony is, that in most of our history, gun laws and gun rights were perfectly reconcilable. As a matter of fact, in our first 200 to 300 years of history, going back to the very beginnings of the nation, we had literally thousands of gun laws of every imaginable variety among localities, among the colonies, and then among the states. And it's really only been in the last few decades that we've seen this issue be reframed as kind of a zero-sum issue in the way that Richard Feldman alludes to, where each side views a victory for their side as a loss for the other side. And that's simply the wrong way to think about this. But our politics have burrowed us in and kind of arrived us at the point where we're at now. And I think President Biden is trying to do what he can through unilateral action. And he's indicated, I think, some pretty useful ideas, especially regarding ghost guns, where through executive orders, he can maybe make some ground on something like that. But big policy change invariably runs through Congress, and that's the bigger policy problem.
And so just get back to your earlier point that there were laws on the books, but it's only been in the last few decades. Is it just as some have described it, a way to actually go out and raise money as a candidate for either side? It's just too political.
Well, it is. I mean, it's the political process, and you're always going to have politics in the political process. But with something like the NRA, it's really kind of dug itself a very deep hole because it has increasingly relied on ever more apocalyptic, dark, pessimistic rhetoric that says that they're coming to get us, that if we make any concession, it'll be the equivalent of surrendering our guns, of government agents pounding on our door in the middle of the night to take our guns away, and this sort of kind of nonsense. And it's not helpful, and it certainly causes the sides to burrow in. But even as you referenced the decision from 2008 that established for the first time that the Second Amendment to our Constitution does provide a right for Americans to own guns for their personal self-protection, as Justice Scalia's decision detailed, essentially it meant, in his terms, that most existing gun laws are fine. And in fact, the political battle really isn't a battle about the substance of the Second Amendment. It's about the Second Amendment as a symbolic talisman that becomes a call to arms. As a matter of law, the Second Amendment really is not in play where we are right now.
Joseph, President Biden announcing these new rules about ghost guns. We've talked about it a little bit here, but this is made at home. There's no serial number. You really can't track them. I think a lot of people weren't even aware that they were out there. How big a deal is this?
Well, it's a significant deal because the problem with ghost guns is a real one. But I think Biden is doing what he can, and I think part of the problem here is that he can't do only so much. His hands are pretty much tied because of what your other guests have been talking about. It takes Congress to act, and it takes Congress to act in a meaningful way. Part of the problem here, a huge part of the problem here, is the fact that Republicans have identified themselves so closely with firearms that it's part of their identity, and you're asking them to give up a part of that identity, and also something that kind of plays into the notion of victimhood. One of your guests said that if they take away your guns, they're coming to get us. Well, who is the they? And the they is fairly clear in that scenario. But I think his move on ghost guns is a good one. It's all he can do. It's what he's trying to do. But the other problem that we have here is not just of mass shootings, but of the daily drumbeat of violence that we never really hear that much about. In fact, of the 300 some odd people who die in the United States every day of gun violence, a full 55% of them are suicide victims. Not that many people are criminals or killed in criminal activity. It's suicide, it's domestic assaults, it's false, it's rather mistaken killings, and it's children getting hold of guns. So the narrative itself needs to change, and the only way it's going to change is if the Republicans start losing elections and the Democrats start winning them.
Richard, the gun industry is a billion-dollar industry.
Mike, can I jump?
Yes,
can I jump in for a second?
Manuel. Yes, go ahead.
This is not in my opinion, and with all your respect, this is not a Republican or a Democratic issue. This is an ethical issue. And if Republicans are holding so hard their guns because they're afraid that because that's exactly what they mean, that we're going to go and take them, well, we're not. We're not going to go and take your guns. And I also have to bring the point that my son was murdered with a gun that was legally purchased. So the whole political map here is allowing our society to arm and then kill each other. That's how this political debate is being holding for decades in here. So then I will assume and conclude that it's our politicians' fault, and they need to fix it. This is about saving lives. This is not about saving guns.
Richard, I was just going to say the gun industry is a billion-dollar industry. One of the things that Biden talked about is that they can't be sued. They're exempt. It's the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. It was enacted in 2005. It largely shields gun manufacturers. Can you explain to us how this happened and what was the logic behind it?
Sure, and the president knows that's not exactly an accurate portrayal. Of course, the gun industry can be sued for a defective product. The problem from the industry's perspective was that they were frequently being sued when a criminal misused a gun by the people who were injured. Well, the manufacturer doesn't have a lot of input on how their product gets used after they sell their product. And what that law did was prevent the civil litigation against gun makers and people in the gun business as long as they followed all the protocols and rules, and it wasn't alleged that there was something defective with the product. Defective products they can be sued for right now. There's no relief from that, nor should there be.
Robert, Biden also said that the U.S. is an international embarrassment, and Nathan talked about that as well, some of these other countries. But I have a good friend in Australia who, every time there's a shooting, he brings up the Port Arthur massacre. That was back in 1996. 35 people were killed. I'm sure you're familiar with this. The government banned automatic, semi-automatic firearms, implemented new licensing requirements, established a firearms registry, and instituted a 28-day waiting period for gun purchases. It also bought back thousands and thousands of guns from private citizens. And it didn't do this in years. It wasn't incremental. This was done in a matter of months. And advocates made this argument, and they hit on it over and over again. If we can register our cars, we can register boats, we can even register our dogs, why can't we register guns? Why can't the argument be boiled down that way here in the United States?
Well, in principle, it can be. And indeed, we have had gun licensing and registration schemes in the states, and those actually go back many, many years as well. That is one idea that I think makes a lot of sense in terms of the ability to figure out where guns are, where they're going, where they've come from, and tracking is one of the problems. Interestingly enough, President Biden talked about replicating a study from a detailed government study from 20 years ago to get better information about gun trafficking, because there is a paucity of information in many respects about questions like this, and this is one of the reasons why there really needs to be more research. I mean, Australia, of course, is a smaller nation. It does have a gun-owning tradition, and indeed, after the mandatory gun buyback program in Australia, they've had no mass shootings since, or perhaps one, I can't quite recall, and it was fairly, quite effective. I mean, in the United States, you could do a buyback program, perhaps more importantly, focus on large capacity ammunition magazines. There's a good argument to be made that arguably should be the bigger focus of regulation as opposed to the firearms themselves. There are lots of ideas. We're getting more and more research and more good policy recommendations, and it's a road that, in order to frankly save lives, is worth traveling down without trampling on legitimate gun rights.
Manuel, what are some things that you'd like to see in terms of legislative action in Congress?
Well, I wanted to see the red flags moving forward, the red flag laws, and I would love to see some safe storage laws too. There's a lot of crime that we could prevent from gun violence just by secure the guns that gun owners have. So as you can listen to me, and after losing my son, I could be reacting in a different way, but I think that I am not in any of my answers telling you that we should remove guns from everybody. And anyone that is in this fight along with me thinks the same way. So that's a lie, a big lie, that it's only delaying the debate and not getting to the point. While we are talking here, someone's being shot, maybe more than one person. And we cannot live that way and consider ourselves a first world nation. Shame on us, and I think the president was right yesterday when he said that shame on us internationally when other countries see what we're doing here.
And Joseph, talk to us about some of those features that he talked about, these stabilizing braces. He talked about that, red flag laws. Explain how this will fit into the broader agenda.
Well, the broader agenda is to try to end mass shootings and try to reduce the ability of a gunman to fire rapidly and fire indiscriminately almost with large capacity magazines, which stabilizers, which enable pistols to behave more like rifles and allow them to act to fire more quickly and with more accuracy. These are all proposals that are aimed at ending the mass shooting events that we've seen over the last few weeks and arguably the last 20, 30 years. And to the point that we are shame on us if we're living this way. We've been living this way for decades. I mean, again, children got shot, a congresswoman got shot, a Republican congressman got shot, supermarkets, daycares, anywhere you want to think about, there have been these sorts of mass shootings that these laws are intended to reduce. But that has still not caused some people, even morally speaking, have caused them to rethink their position about guns and to rethink why they are standing in the way of gun reform. No one needs an assault weapon. No one needs a large capacity magazine. They're only there for one thing, and it's not sportsmanship. So I think what President Biden is trying to do is to start the conversation by doing what he can, hoping that the weight of public opinion will help move some opponents of gun control and force people to declare whether they are or are not for mass killing machines that are legal on our streets and are turning a blind eye to the everyday violence that we experience that doesn't make the headlines.
Richard, it's worth pointing out that you've worked on bipartisan gun control measures in the past. Let's listen to what Biden had to say, and I want to get your thoughts on the other side.
Gun violence in America, for those of you who think of this from an economic standpoint listening to me, estimated to cost the nation $280 billion, let me say it again, $280 billion a year. You say, how could that be, Joe? Hospital bills, physical therapy, trauma counseling, legal fees, prison costs, and the loss of productivity. For a fraction of the cost of gun violence, we can save lives, create safe and healthy communities, and build economies that work for all of us, and save billions of American dollars. In the meantime,
Richard, it sounds like a win-win. Is he framing the argument in the right way?
Well, I think he's talking about, all the things that could be done, and if it all worked out as promised, wouldn't it be better? Well, of course it would. The problem is you're not going to get most of them done, and by asking to get everything done, you're limiting yourself and probably ensuring nothing gets done, and that's unfortunate.
So what should he be pushing for?
I think he should be focused on the background check system, improving what we have, and for 20 years the firearm industry supported and continues to mandatory background checks in the commercial sales of firearms, where the gun owners get very upset, and so far the legislation's going in the right direction, is intrafamilial transfers within the family. That's been a problem. Maybe we might get there. But just like what happened after Newtown, if we say everything's on the table, let's talk about high-capacity magazines, let's talk about semi-automatics, let's talk about all these other issues, you end up providing more people to the table that are going to be in opposition to one thing, but it may as well be in opposition to everything, and nothing will be accomplished.
All right, I want to give Manuel the last word. You had the first word. I want to give you the last word. What's your hopes?
Well, I disagree. I think that we should, we keep listening that if we ask for more, it's never going to happen. I think that we should ask for everything that it takes to save lives. Again, nobody wants to be where I am right now, and you don't have to go through what we went through to be part of a solution. So I assume that at some point society will demand a better future for their kids and for themselves, and that will include a lot of regulations when it comes to gun ownership.
I want to thank all our panelists for joining us. Really appreciate this robust conversation. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.